Hey everybody. I hope that you are doing well and that you're learning some things on D2L and your online learning course. You seem to be doing well so far, most of you anyway. So I just wanted to do a little bit of an overview of what you've learned so far and then give you direction as to what you'll be learning this week. So beginning in Unit 2, which is called Relationships, you started learning about European contact. And the first person that you learned about was Columbus. And when he came to North America, you learned about some of the devastation that happened, but you also learned about some positive things. And one of those positive things that you learned about was the Columbian Exchange, which I had you think about different plants, animals, and goods that went from North America to Europe and from Europe to North America. And you did a great job figuring out which ones you thought were the most important to go from here to there and from there to here. Then after that, you did learn some more negatives. Specifically, you learned a lot about disease and the diseases that were brought here that the indigenous people weren't used to. And the biggest one, if you think back and remember, was smallpox. They weren't used to smallpox. They didn't have an immunity built up for smallpox, and it ravaged them. If you also remember from your reading, what you saw is that some people blamed a group called the Jesuits. And the Jesuits were Catholic missionaries who came to the New World to help sort of not change people, but try to convert them to Christianity and specifically to Catholicism so that they weren't quote unquote savage anymore. After that happened, the next thing that you learned about was just a little bit of an overview. And what I asked you to think about was Pocahontas. And we used Pocahontas for you to have some critical thinking about stories and how they may or may not be true. And if they're not true, then you need to figure out why. And maybe that helps you figure out some people and the thoughts that they had around what was happening at the time. So when you finish that, the last thing you looked at, which was just at the end of last week or sometime during last week, and that was Louis Riel. And I put Louis Riel into this unit because he fought a lot for the Métis and he tried to work for the relationship between the Métis and the government, and it didn't work. He ended up being thought of as both a hero and a traitor, depending on which side you were on, and really depending on when. He was thought of more as a traitor while he was alive, and the hero part more after he died. And we talked about that as well. You learned about how he was more of a hero in death, and they were looking at exonerating him, so taking away all of the blame that they had given him when he was alive for what happened at Red River and what happened between the Métis and the government. So what we're going to look at this week is something called the Indian Act. And the Indian Act, even though it was first put in place in 1755, was actually used universally in 1876. Okay, so that's the Indian Act. And I want you to think about what might be important between these two time frames. What happened to Canada between those two dates? And if you can't remember, it's something that you would have learned along the way, and it's Confederation. So Canada became a nation. And so the Indian Act was put into place as a way sort of for the government to, well, for lack of a better term, to govern. Sorry about that. So Confederation really made it so that the government felt that they needed to have even more control over the Indigenous people, and that's why the Indian Act was in place. So as you're listening to the podcast that we'll be listening to this week called Indian Act, there are two things I want you to think about. I want you to think about the name Indian Act, and then I want you to think about the question of the treaties and how the treaties were different, and how that might lead to both positive and negative things between the British and the Indigenous people. So what you're going to do, listen to the podcast. Today we're just listening to the first 12 minutes of it. You're going to then use the link in D2L to go to Microsoft Forms, and you're going to answer the two questions that are there. The first one will ask you explicitly, what do you think about the name Indian Act? And do you think that it's still right for it to be named Indian Act? And there will be some things at the very beginning of the video, or of the podcast, for you to kind of be able to start to form an opinion of that for yourself if you don't have one already, and you can use those in your answer. And the second question is, at the end of this section, explain the difference between the British treaties and the Indigenous treaties. Explain how this could lead to both positive and negative relations between the British and the Indigenous. So I want you to think about that. We'll stop it at just past the 12-minute mark. Then you can go to the link in D2L to Microsoft Forms, and you can answer those questions. So here is the podcast for you, and again called Indian Act. So I want you to listen, and I'll pause it after they stop talking about the name Indian Act so that you can take time if you need to, and you know where that part ends, and then you can think about the treaties.
This is a CBC podcast.
Do you know what the Indian Act is?
Indian Act? Off the top of my head, I'm not 100% certain.
No idea.
I knew there was some laws, and I just didn't know what it was called.
I don't know why you still call it the Indian Act when it's politically incorrect.
The Indian Act, like the Redskin Act, the kind of
reflects the mindset of the time that when it was created.
Does the Indian Act affect your life in any way?
No, not really, no.
I don't think so. I still don't really know what it is. So.
Yeah. So I'm sure there are other people that are affected by this every day. I'm just not one of them.
Hey, Leah.
Hey, Phelan.
Happy Indigenous Month.
Yay.
Yay.
But shouldn't I be saying, is that one of those things where you're like, oh, happy birthday. Actually, today's my birthday.
I've never done that, but yeah, kind of is that, though.
Well, here, I got you this lovely pen that was already here when we got into the studio.
Oh, so thank you.
Happy day.
So today I thought, because we are in the month of June, which is Pride Month, but it's not only Pride Month, it is also Indigenous History Month.
That's right.
So I thought we should look at something that deserves some more attention, in my opinion. The Indian Act.
And just FYI, the Indian Act, just for people who have never heard of it, is not the highly anticipated sequel to the book Indian in the Cupboard, which I read in school. Did you read that book in school?
No.
I read it in school growing up, and actually there was a sequel to this book. Many of them. There was The Return of the Indian, The Secret of the Indian, The Mystery of the Cupboard, and The Key to the Indian.
I feel like these are all chapters in my autobiography.
It was basically about this plastic Indian, I'm putting that in quotes, toy that turned into a living Indigenous chief. Of course, he was a chief. But anyway, the reason I tell you all about the racist things I read as a child is for the kids today. Kids, don't read the book. And even though Canada still has a major piece of legislation with the word, don't use the term Indian.
Yeah, and I'm going to be saying it a lot today because in this episode it's pretty unavoidable.
It's what it's called.
Yeah,
it's what it's called.
Yeah, the term Indian is deeply entrenched in law and policy in this country. So while I wouldn't use it publicly otherwise, today I will be saying it a lot. The point is, just because the government uses outdated racist terminology doesn't mean you should.
Okay, so let's get into it.
All right.
So that's where the conversation ends about the term Indian. They'll be talking about the Indian Act itself now. So you can either go now to the Microsoft form and answer the first question and then come back to this, or you can listen to all of this and then go to the Microsoft form and answer both questions.
So I have to say, as an Indigenous person, the Indian Act has always been a bit of a mystery to me. I know that it impacts me, and I know how in some ways, but I know there's a lot that I don't understand. And I figured there must be some other people out there, some Indigenous people who feel the same way. So today, I wanted to take a closer look at it.
This is good because I, like many Canadians I know really very little about it, or maybe even nothing. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Let's learn.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's learn together.
That's what we're here to do.
Hold my hand, fail it. No,
All
that's
right.
fine. Okay.
Yeah,
that's
okay.
fine. Okay, keep going.
So it's not uncommon that people don't know things about this piece of policy. And so today what I thought we would do is I would give us some basics of the Indian Act and demystify it, and then look at the human cost of this piece of policy so we can better understand how it has and continues to impact Indigenous people. And I want to look at mainly how it impacts Indigenous women.
Right. We really can't do an in-depth section by section look at the Indian Act because that would be a 136 part episode, but we can look at how it came to be.
Yes.
So, what is the Indian Act?
The Act is Canadian federal law that governs all matters regarding to Indian status, bans, and Indian reserves. It was passed as law in 1876 and still remains as Canadian law. You can actually read it online if you want to. I found it incredibly boring, but please feel free to do it if you wish.
What an endorsement.
And while many people in Canada, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, dislike the Act and feel like it should just be gotten rid of, it really isn't that easy.
So why do we have it then?
Well, I think to find that out, we need to look at the roots of this deeply disturbing piece of policy.
All right, let's talk about it.
All right, so to understand the Indian Act, we have to go back to when the Indian Department was created. And Leah, can you guess when that may have been?
Okay, so I'm going to say around the time of Confederation. I'm going to spitball. I'm just throwing out a number. 1840.
No.
Okay,
no,
great.
No. It actually goes back to 1755.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, why was it created then? Because that is well before Confederation.
Yeah, absolutely. So back in 1755, much of the world was about to enter into a giant war called the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War is actually even sometimes referred to as like the true First World War because it was so expansive across the globe.
Yeah, and it was also called the French and Indian War.
Correct. So what was basically going on was that the French, they had begun to settle in North America more and more. Many Indigenous nations sided with the French because the French had a deep trade relationship with many Indigenous nations. The French definitely had settled in North America in more of a capacity of trade. They had also come over with Jesuits, and so when Jesuits were coming over, they wanted to establish a good relationship with a lot of Indigenous people because they wanted to convert them.
We talked a bit about this in the statues episode with Samuel de Champlain and that whole crew.
Yeah.
They were big into
Trade.
and, you know, quote unquote saving souls and all that.
Yes. So there had been skirmishes kicking up in the Ohio Valley, and this was a time before Canada was Canada and America was America. So the Brits decide that they need to get some Indigenous allies on side. So they create the Indian Department. Initially, it was actually under a military branch of the British government.
You know, the fastest way to make new friends is always to create a department in their name.
A Department of Friendship. Yeah.
Hey, Jason, I've created a Jason department. Why don't you stop on by and we'll review some documents? Like, great way to making allies. Okay, so this Indian department, which would go on eventually to become Indian Affairs, and now it's the Department of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, was started under the British military. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
And it seems weird, but the department was started as a way for the British to attempt to secure these good relations with Indigenous people.
Why?
Well, so they would fight alongside them, first in the 7 Years' War, and then again in the American Revolution or the Revolutionary War, and then once more during the War of 1812.
Right, because I'm sure many Indigenous people would know the land and waterways and have a good idea of strategy and tactics on their own land.
Yeah, exactly. Indigenous people were invaluable during these conflicts. But we are getting a bit ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to 1763.
Okay.
And the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. So, the war ends. France gets beat and has to cede, which means to give up most of their land in North America.
But we should say it wasn't really their land to begin with.
No, it
okay,
wasn't.
just to clarify.
Yeah, no.
Okay,
no.
but they give it up. Okay.
They give it up. They give it to the Brits, and King George III has the Royal Proclamation drawn up.
Good title if you're a royal. Okay, and what did he proclaim?
Well, the document proclaimed British ownership over North America, but it also laid out territorial guidelines and established how it would be governed. It set aside Indian territory that was specific for First Nations use, and it explicitly states,
And whereas it is just and reasonable and essential to our interest and the security of our colonies that the several nations or tribes of Indians with whom we are connected and who live under our protection should not be molested or disturbed in the possession of such parts of our dominions and territory as, not having been ceded to or purchased by us, are reserved to them and or any of them as their hunting grounds.
it sounded
I
like
was doing
something-
Benedict
yeah.
Cumberbatch
Oh.
meets like Prince Charles.
It sounded like something from like Dangerous Liaisons. It was like very bodice ripping. Okay, so the Royal Proclamation is incredibly important because it explains how the treaty process and the nation-to-nation relationship would function, and how the Crown should associate with First Nations people. It also forbids settlers from squatting on Indigenous territory and stated that all land deals had to go through the Crown.
Okay, gotcha.
So when the first Indian Department Superintendent, Sir William Johnson, heard about the Royal Proclamation, he knew it was a big deal.
So what did he do?
Well, he set up a gathering at Fort Niagara with many First Nations.
Okay, so a gathering, was it a joyful gathering, like a celebration, or was it more of a meeting?
I think
Was it like-
it was more of a meeting to sort of solidify and establish these new relationships between First Nations and the Crown, because some Indigenous nations had sided with the French previously, and the British Crown wanted to make sure that they were creating inroads and making new allies with these Indigenous nations.
Right, because the British were the new colonial power in town, and they wanted to be like, hey, girl.
Yeah, we know you were with France before, but
But,
that's
like, look
cool. That's cool. Don't worry. Just let us come hang out. We promise we won't take anything, but actually we are going to take a lot of stuff and put it in museums. Yeah.
So, this gathering.
All right.
Let's get back to it.
Okay, yeah. So at this gathering, this is when we see the Silver Covenant chain wampum belt being used to solidify the relationship between the Crown and First Nations people moving forward. Wampum belts are a traditional form of contracts for many Indigenous people. They were made out of quahog shells and they were threaded together. And the Silver Covenant chain, it shows two figures holding sort of a chain between the two of them, and this is to signify peace and friendship. This treaty was also called the Treaty of Niagara, and the belt was a document for Indigenous people.
A wampum belt, when we think of a contract, a lot of people think in their mind paper. But a wampum belt is actually a physical, like large, spanning piece of, it almost looks like fabric, but it is made of shells, right?
Yeah,
Shells and different threading and different colors.
Made out of these tiny quahog shells, which are blue or like purpley blue and white. And so it would take, some people say it would take an Indigenous woman one whole day to make one shell.
Wow.
And so these are, they're long, and so it would take a lot of hours. And so at this gathering, the Indigenous people brought this belt, and the British brought the Royal Proclamation. And so it was sort of this like merging of agreements, right?
Right,
And I
right.
think for me really speaks to that idea of nation to nation relationships.
Right. So it was like, here's our contract in our language. Here's our contract in our language on paper.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Very cool. Yeah, that's so interesting because the Royal Proclamation was even referenced in the Constitution of 1982, our Constitution in Canada. So it is still very much part of the fabric of this country.
It's also been called the Indian Magna Carta or the Indian Bill of Rights. So we now have an Indian Department and the Royal Proclamation in play. So after the American Revolution and the War of 1812, the country of Canada begins to take shape, and the nation-to-nation relationship begins to shift.
This is where our first part of this podcast ends. So what you do now, go to the link for Microsoft Forms and answer the questions. There are 2 questions, remember? The one about Indian Act and the one about the 2 treaties and how they could be both positive and negative for both the British and the Indigenous people. if you need, I did also provide a link in D2L for the transcript for this. So if you want to, you can follow along, or you can go back and read it if there are parts that you didn't quite understand or that you forget that you want to add into your answers. You can go back to the transcript and read it. So that ends today's lesson. Hopefully this helps you figure out a little bit about the Indian Act and what it did for Canada. We'll continue on with this podcast in our next lesson.